This week on the Eldritch Lorecast, a discussion about monsters spins into a grand debate about damage resistances, immunities, vulnerabilities, and how much damage does a bucket of water do in 5th edition. All that and more right now. Hello everybody and welcome to this week's episode of the Eldritch Lorecast. My name is Ben Byrne and I'm here as always with Shawn Merwin, Dael Kingsmill, and sitting in once again for James Hake is Logan Reese. Logan, if you had a favourite monster, what would it be? Like a mythological monster, something that's sort of relatively well known?
Oh shoot, that is tough, because I was going to say the Baise, just because it is a living monster catalog. Something that's well known. I don't know, Mind Flayers are really, really iconic in a weird way. That's one of the first things that drew me to D&D, so I think off the cuff, they are an interesting species that can always be expanded upon.
Have you used them in a campaign before?
Yes, they were the major background to one of the characters that I had played.
Oh, okay. As in, like, had a direct link to them, or the son of a Mind Flayer?
He was a failed Mind Flayer experiment.
Oh, okay. Interesting. Dael Kingsmill, I'm sure you've got about 30 of these up your sleeve, but if you had to pick one...
I can't believe you're making me choose. This is ludicrous. This is a crime. I don't know. There's so many. Maybe I would pick the Chimera from Greek mythology, just because there's something about it that is so, like, I don't know, I don't have a word for it, like Technicolor, you know, like it's so explicitly like, I don't know, man, we just took 3 things and we shoved them together, you know, like it doesn't make excuses. It just says, no, it was a lion, but it had a fire-breathing snake tail, and also there was a goat head for some reason. You know what I mean? Like, it doesn't try to be fancy. It just goes, that's it. That's what you're fighting today, Bellerophon.
I enjoy the Chimera in a D&D context in terms of, like, confusing the party when they're doing a monster hunt, and you're like, you know, you find the prints of a lion in the dirt, but you hear a goat bleating, you know, across the way.
Yeah.
And particularly savvy players start to put it together and they're like, oh, this thing can fly because its tracks just stop, you know, over here. So it must, okay, lion, goat, fly. It's a chimera, you know?
Yeah,
it's
that's the good stuff. Plus, Magic the Gathering has some very good chimeras.
That's true as well, yeah. We were talking about puzzle monsters the other week. I think the chimera is an excellent sort of puzzle monster for the party to look at. Shawn Merwin, if you had to pick a favourite monster.
It's part of my problem with picking a favorite monster and then translating to D&D is there are some great mythological monsters that are hard to model in a good D&D game. Like the Medusa is an incredible mythological creature. But to have something where if you fail a saving throw, just turn to stone and you're done, that's tough. A siren is the same thing, right? It's like it's got this wonderful power that's not so fun as a player if, you're charmed and... now what? You're stuck on an island for the rest of your life.
Absolution.
So I'm going to go with the Cyclops, the Cyclopace.
Okay.
They're cool to think about. They're giant, so they can do some damage. But players see the one eye, and they know what to do. They want to have some fun.
Mm-hmm. Back to
that's a great mythological monster with a great story, and then it works really well, I think, at a D&D milieu.
Yeah. Adventure Time. Yeah, it's a good one. Adventure Time had a clever play on that where they introduced earclopses and their major weakness was loud noises. Really cool.
Right. That is clever. I'd have to go with, if I was going to choose a favorite monster, low-level parties, having a griffin or a pair of griffins works just in terms of, like, it's simple, it's an animalistic beast, they can hunt it and not feel guilty about it. But I'd have to, like, that's one. See, I'm picking 2, so I'm cheating, but I'm allowed.
I want to change mine.
I would have to go with the Banshee or any sort of, like, wraith or spirit that has a bit of a story behind it, because they're so rich for creating really interesting, sometimes morally complex quests and stories around them that I've countlessly used incorporeal undead in different campaigns because of the possibility for storytelling.
I can't believe you've done this. I can't believe you picked 2. I'm rebelling.
What would be
I'm
your
outta
second
here.
pick? Dael, if you had to choose
Probably a
second.
Hydra.
Okay.
Oh, Hydra's good. I want to say Salamander, just because of the hilarious history of the creation of the mythological salamander, where someone saw a real one and described it very, very poorly, and people just took the notes and ran with it. They're like, oh, it is cold, it must put out fire, and then they just went from there. It's ridiculous.
Well, speaking of monsters, this week sees the release of the Monster Grimoire, which is the monster tome that Shawn has been working on last year. It is releasing as a PDF, I should quickly clarify, so it's not the physical copies yet. They will be coming to Kickstarter backers a little bit later in the year, but the PDF is available to backers, and now if you didn't back the Kickstarter, you can purchase the PDF for the Monster Grimoire at ghostfiregaming.com, which I was saying this off air just before, I love as a DM, as a forever DM, monster manuals, monster grimoires, because they're like Christmas trees for dungeon masters, where you just flick through, every page is a new monster, every page is a potential new story, and you might not click with every single monster in there, but as I was saying with Wraiths, you might look at a couple of monsters and just be like, I know exactly the story that goes around this thing. I know exactly the quest that I want my party to have to undertake, whether it sits at the center of a campaign or it's just something that's kind of small side questy. We talked a couple weeks ago about designing monsters and that process that you went through, Shawn, but I guess the question I'd ask today for people, especially if they're cracking open the Monster Grimoire, is how do you as a dungeon master go about choosing monsters? What are you looking for when you're looking through a tome and looking for a monster for a campaign, an encounter, a session? What are the things that you kind of pick out and go like, yes, this monster is cool, I want to use this one?
Well, I mean, to get mechanical, you have to start right away with the challenge rating. And while challenge rating isn't a perfect gauge for how tough a monster is, at least gets you in the right zone. The second thing you want to look at then is, do you want to challenge your party with multiple creatures in a combat or a series of combats, or one creature? So if you have a first level party, you don't want to throw 7 CR2 monsters at them. So you want to go one that sort of works as a creature on its own. So when I look at things, I look at it first mechanically, but then in the background, you always have to say what fits into my story, the story that I'm trying to facilitate here. What has the story background that's going to fit? We don't want, a giant being the criminal mastermind in a village full of Weshelkind, right? They would just stand out. So you need to find something that fits your story. So, that's where I begin.
I think we've talked about favorite monsters from the Grimoire specifically in a previous episode where we were talking about it. But is there something in the tome, Shawn, that stood out to you as like, almost the story came to you first before the monster, or even one of the monsters you didn't necessarily design because it was written by a team? Was there one that was like, I know exactly the quest that this thing is going to be at the center of?
Well, the Demon Oak comes to mind right away. There's a brilliant art and the miniature. I call it a miniature, but it's quite large.
Statue.
That just has its own story right from the start. You get close to the Demon Oak, and it's got things surrounding it. It's got chains hanging off of it. It's howling. It's its own story right away. One of the monsters that just came to mind when you said that is called the Snarite. And this was another one that was created by one of my students, and it's so unconventional, but I knew it had to be in the book. This is a huge spoiler for players, and it's sort of one of those monsters where I hate to even bring it up, because a DM is going to use this, and the player would never be able to figure out in a million years what's happening until they actually get deep within the the adventure, the game. But imagine going into a town and you meeting people for the first time, and everyone is either bald or has super long hair. And so that's the first thing that you describe to your players. And people are going to, okay, maybe it's a religious thing. Yeah, maybe it's a religious, right? You're suspicious, but why?
But of what? Like, how do you explain that?
And I'm not going to spoil it. I'm going to leave it right there. And I'm going to say,
I want to know.
I want to go to there. So, that monster just brings to mind so many cool role-playing things that you could do.
Yes, with hair.
And yes, with hair.
There's a musical that's come to town and everybody's got really long hair for some reason. Dael, I know you do a fair bit of homebrewing. I think we've talked about this before, where you don't leave monster stat blocks alone. You almost have to rewrite them in their entirety. Does this mean that you're changing a lot of the rules, or it's just kind of like transforming it so that you can read it closer? How do you go about choosing monsters when you're setting up sessions?
A little bit of both. So if I'm like, a lot of the time I will have in mind, wouldn't it be cool if they ran into something like this, right? And so then I can just go from scratch. But plenty of times I'm like, feels like I need to spice this up. Feels like there needs to be a little bit of something. And I do what any DM does. I go to the monster manual and I start flipping through it. But I just let myself be guided very much by names and pictures. So, yeah, it's very important. Got to be a picture book for me. Avoid the maths. No, I flip through and I go, that looks so cool. Or isn't that name so evocative? That's really cool. And then I start reading about it, and inevitably it's like, oh, it doesn't really do what I wanted it to do. You know, like displace a beast. I love the concept of displace a beast. And even you read the fluff about them and it's like, oh, this is great, this is cool. But the stat block for me doesn't quite meet up with that narrative. And so, I tweak some things. And it's fine. And I mean, the benefit of that for me is that I can also look at something and go, that's really cool. And I want to use it this week, despite it being twice as difficult as my party should be able to handle. So let me see what I can trim so that they won't all die. So I don't know. I am very much, I mean, it must be getting so tiresome for the listeners that every time you're like, how do you do it? And I go, well, I rewrite it. It's a great answer. It's very helpful.
Yeah, I think, if the monster is too difficult for the party to fight against, sometimes that's a plus for me when I'm looking at monsters. I'm like, the story of this thing...
You would say that.
Yeah, the story of this thing is that you can't just fight it and make it flee, which somebody whose name starts with D and second name starts with K recently wrote an article or a blog post on the Ghostfire Gaming blog about encounters with monsters where fighting it isn't necessarily the optimal choice or the main kind of point of the adventure. And in this article, this mysterious Kale Dinsmill wrote about, the monster shouldn't necessarily, or the conflict shouldn't necessarily be about the monster is too difficult for the party to fight, because that kind of puts them in a bit of a no-win situation, or, I don't want to speak for you, Dael, so feel free to take over if I'm not quite getting the thrust of what you were saying.
I was basically just talking about the fact that in narratives, we are very used to this idea of, like, the heroes occasionally coming up against something that they cannot possibly beat. And in a story or a TV show or a movie, that's great, that's fine, it makes perfect narrative sense. But when you've got a bunch of D&D players and you put this monster in front of them and say, this is too powerful for you, you cannot fight it, there are basically two options. Either they try to fight it and they die because they couldn't beat it, and that's no good because it just takes all the power away from the players. Or they try to fight it and they do win, which doesn't get you where you wanted to be. I mean, they might not try to fight it, but I feel like that kind of falls into the category of, taking the agency away. Again, it's that same thing. If you can't fight this, and they go, oh, great, well, I guess we don't have any choice but to not fight it. What I think is more handy in that situation is to try to tempt your players rather than threatening them. Just sort of going, oh, you could try to fight this guy. Absolutely, you could, but they have something that you need. And if you kill them, you can't get it. You won't have access to it. And I think it plays into this sort of broader idea of, when you are coming up to an encounter, know what you want the stakes to be. Know what you want to be on the line for your party. And that way obviously communication, try to make sure that it aligns with your party and what they want. Because if your party just want a fun romp and you're like, the stakes are death, then maybe it's not going to go great. But, you can come up to a thing and say, someone's going to get hurt in this fight. And you can try to build an encounter that, is that level of dangerous. Or you can say, the players are going to have to give up on their morals and work with this bad guy in order to, figure out the next part of this overarching puzzle in the story. That can be part of the stakes as well.
Yeah, sure. I guess not really counterpoint. Like I agree with everything that you've said. My proclivity for using encounters that, in theory are very hard for the party to fight, whether it's like certain death for them or just like, somebody's going to get seriously injured if you go up against this thing, is used in a mix. Sometimes you throw goblins at them that they're just meant to slaughter and it's easy. Sometimes you throw some moral quandary at them where they could fight the monster, but the monster's not really in the wrong. They're bandits trying to feed their families or something like that. And you also throw in the mix these sort of encounters where the monster is, kind of too strong for you. So you have to figure out another way to deal with this problem. And it reminds me of, like, I suppose where that comes from is, and this is a bit of a deep pull for anybody who didn't play video games in the early 2000s, late 90s, but the original Half-Life games, the Half-Life 1 in particular, I remember, had these areas where there were these aliens that you just could not shoot. Like, you could not kill them by shooting them. And so the entire stage was a puzzle around how to get rid of this thing so that you could progress to the next area. And it was something along the lines of, turn on some power over here, which activates like an electric barrier, and then lure the monster through the electric barrier, and that kills it. And I just remember those stages being super heart pounding, whenever you were forced to be in a room with this thing that you couldn't kill. And the puzzle of figuring out how to get rid of it was kind of equally enjoyable to just running in there and gunning it down. And that feeling doesn't translate perfectly to tabletop RPGs, but when selecting monsters from a grimoire, sometimes I'm flicking through and I look at the CR and I'm like, this thing's too weak for the party where they're at. Maybe they're level 6 or 7, and I'm like, no, I want the narrative of this thing to be it's really hard to kill. This thing's not going to work for what I need it for this particular point in the campaign. Logan, you have also written a manual of monsters, so to speak, Stibble's Codex of Companions. What was it's a bit of a different style of monster manual, but what was your approach when working on that? Why did you want to write that book?
Oh, it was the first book I wanted to write. Like, growing up, I had a lot of pets, and I loved every single one of them. And the moment that I got into video games, the ones I cared the most about were ones where you could have, like, little pets or companions. And that's all I would ever focus on. So when I got the idea, like, hey, I kind of want to write a book, of course it's going to be a monster manual. And I wanted it to just be a bunch of things that you could summon or that could follow you around and help you fight. Because being a summoner in D&D it's a very temporary thing. You have one spell slot, you have 1 hour for these other things that are probably going to help you or not, and then they go away. So I thought it would be interesting to add more like companion-esque creatures.
Yeah, I think they're great. It's kind of flicking through it. It gives so many more options in terms of like familiars in particular, but also gives a bunch of rules at the back of it in terms of, how to take care of your familiar or your companion, how to create a bond with it, what will cause it to leave if you're mean to it, et cetera, et cetera. So
yeah, it's a D&D Tamagotchi.
yeah, exactly.
I love the idea of just recreating that vibe of like when Pikachu follows you around in Pokemon Yellow.
How do you go about... sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I assumed you were going to ask that question. I was going straight to answering it.
Go for it.
Assuming it's the same one, because I also rewrite them, but in the opposite direction. So normally, obviously, you have to start with the stat block, make the difficulty, try and match the party. But instead of adjusting the stat block, I'll completely change the description of the monster using that stat block. So the way it goes about making its attacks are going to be completely different. and it'll look different. And like I could replace a piercing attack with a tentacle attack and just change the damage type. And I really like before I start any of that, I think about the fact, or in my opinion, that monsters are generally either symptomatic or the creators of their environment. So the setting or location that they're in is the most important part about picking or designing the monster, because either it's really comfortable in this environment and it has the edge, or it is actively creating the problems around you and around it that it's facing.
Yeah, a perfect example of this tweaking is I was running the first episode of Fables this weekend, and I wanted to put an encounter before they enter the first adventuring site. So I just flipped to Drakes. I wanted to have a Drake-like monster. So I flipped to the Grimoire, and there's a Plague Drake. And I didn't want it to be Plague, though. It had to have something to do with Obsidian. So it became an Obsidian Drake, using the same stats. But its bites were a little bit different. They did a little bit of different damage. So even the monsters I make, I tweak along the way. It's the best way to get the right monster for the job that you're trying to do.
The urge is strong.
Sometimes I'll even adapt them in the middle of the encounter. Like I'm like, okay, well, maybe they should probably be able to do this. So I flip to another monster. I just throw in that ability or attack or action that they can take. Just mix it up.
Yeah, I don't think I've had a stat or used a stat block that's been entirely untouched by me in some way since, I can't even remember when. Whether it's adding multi-attack, taking multi-attack away, something as simple as that. Because when you strip it all down, the monsters really are, as in any of the rule system, as in any RPG, they really are just numbers, and making their health number hit 0 before they make the party's health number hit 0. Some of my favorite monsters, and I think this is why third-party monster manuals are really great, like the Grimoire, because I find that the monster manual itself, the Wizards one, tends to have a lot of very similar stat blocks to represent different things. So there's not a huge difference between things like an owlbear, a cyclops, a minotaur, whatever it is. There's like one fairly minor extra
It's true,
ability.
and you should say it.
It's just a chunk with multi-attack. That's kind of all.
Yeah, exactly. Whereas I find that the third-party ones tend to have much more flavorful, specific, unique rules for each stat block.
I mean, part of that seems to be that, third-party monster books often have a specific subgenre in mind. Like if we're talking about the Grimoire and it being dark fantasy, grim fantasy, that's very different to Wizards of the Coast trying to publish something that can be applicable in any setting that you want to use it in. That's a tough job. Like, they've done a bang-up job, but also you're true and you should say it. You're true?
Yeah.
You're true.
You're true. I think it's also kind of interesting that a lot of the base monsters for D&D, the new ones that they've made have more of it, but very, very few of them have non-combat focused abilities.
Yeah.
Like a lot of them don't really have any like spells or unique traits that they can use in social settings or in exploration. So they can't help the party, they can just bash heads.
Very few even have skills listed.
Yeah, that's true.
Stealth and things.
That there's a limited number of those skills that are going to be ususeful for the monsters, right?
For sure, but when you look at the Displacer Beast and they don't have a stealth stat, are you kidding me? You're going to make me calculate their stealth bonus? I'm going to be using that.
Yeah, I guess, but like how do you, this is, I guess, a general question. How do you rule intimidation? Like there are stat blocks. I think the Thug maybe has intimidation, but in theory, the characters or the players should be able to choose if their character is intimidated or not by an NPC, which 90% of the time they're probably not going to be.
Yeah. That is interesting. I've never thought of that.
Well, how many of those like non-combat skills are going to be useful, right? Like I've got in a really, I think, bad habit at the moment just because it takes me so much more time to prep where I'm like, everything needs a stat block. This shopkeeper needs a stat block and their shop assistant needs a stat block because you never know when a fight's going to break out. but they're not relevant unless a fight does break out. So half your NPCs don't even really need stat blocks. And that can be why, I suppose, like non-combat skills, I think they're fantastic when they exist in monsters if they're appropriate for the monster, the NPC, whatever. But it's probably why not a lot of them exist to my thinking. Shawn, you can confirm or deny.
Yeah, I mean, it sort of goes back to all stat blocks tend to be the same. Well, if all stat blocks tend to be the same, then you don't need a commoner stat block, but with proficiency in cobbling, or it's nice to have, but you as the DM really don't need that.
Yes, that's fair.
Yeah.
Major...
along those lines, I was on a podcast earlier today, and we're like, do we really need a stat block for all the different kinds of dragons?
Yes.
Every dragon is like, I mean, yes,
they are
it's
kind
cool
of
to
the
have,
same. No,
but they're all like bite, 2 claws, a breath weapon of some kind that does a elemental kind of damage. Even that they have legendary actions and layer actions, and they're all sort of the same. They can do this one thing. So we were like, do we really need all of those? Of course we do.
You're right. I don't think that we do, because but then again, I'm the person who goes through and I'm like, every dragon is unique. I'll write a brand new stat block for every single one. So maybe don't.
Right. And the lore can be completely different, and that's cool. But for the stat block, as a DM, I'm like, I can sort of do this from memory at this point. I don't really need to know that the black dragon is doing acid breath, because of course it is.
If we can use the same stat block for every dragonborn, but with a little table in there that says, okay, if you're copper, you do this.
Right.
Why can't we do that for dragons?
Page filling.
Mm-hmm.
I think that all the dragons, particularly the chromatic ones, have slightly different CR, right? Because the numbers are very, as much as this does or doesn't matter, the numbers are very slightly tweaked. Yeah, it's like, a black dragon might have plus 14 to hit on an attack, whereas a red dragon has plus 16 or whatever. So, at that point, it's kind of like, who cares? Yeah. It's going to hit.
I wanted to say that one of my major pet peeves with every stat block in like Core 5e is the fact that resistances and what's the other end of that? Vulnerabilities
are
almost never used. They are never used. I would love to just run through the entire monster manual and add some contextual ones to creatures. Like fire elementals need a lot more that can just take them out, because I don't know. Fire elementals is a weird point to make there, but it's a problem that I have that I would like solved just by running through everything.
Just to clarify, sorry, do you mean that not resistances, vulnerabilities? Now I'm tripping on the word. Do you mean that vulnerabilities specifically are never used, or that resistances, immunities, and vulnerabilities are never used?
I feel like in general they are rarely used, and a lot more creatures would narratively benefit from having them, because then players get to explore unique ways of dealing more damage to monsters that would make sense to deal more damage to the monsters. Like skeletons are one of the minor ones that have it. You can beat them in really easily, but you can't stab them. And that should apply to more monsters, but it doesn't.
So I'm just I feel like you've like cracked open a can of worms, pulled the pin on a grenade, and I'm gonna throw it.
Yeah, I'm looking up fire elementals now. Go on.
Well, get rid of it. I've seen a lot of discourse online around, people disliking or liking damage resistances, immunities, and vulnerabilities because they're fairly arbitrary, I suppose, is the opinion of some people. And I love resistances and I love immunities because it challenges the party. If you allow the party to operate in their optimum way all the time, the caster sits at the back and casts their powerful spells, the fighters get up and they tank the damage, the rangers and rogues kind of slip between the cracks and deal like massive damage in short bursts, then they're going to slaughter every combat, right? But I think that, like I said before, a mix of easy combats, difficult combats, and morally complex combats or encounters, throwing in encounters that allow the party to act exactly how they want to in a combat or operate exactly how they need to in a combat, and then throwing in a mix of combats that are like it's a bunch of lycanthropes. Your swords won't work. Well, hopefully the counterpoint to this is often, well, that's just boring for the fighter because they're just punching a brick wall and nothing's working. But finding a way to make that engaging and forcing the players to find suboptimal but still effective ways for their character to operate in that fight, I think is an interesting puzzle if you can figure out how to do it well.
How to signpost it properly.
Yeah. Here's a game designer deep dive. Ready? As a game designer, the biggest enemy you face isn't players. It's the difference between the inexperienced players and the advanced players. Because if you create something that challenges those advanced players, give lots of immunities or resistances, and so they have to work around them, experienced players are going to work around them very quickly and will be easier. Whereas your inexperienced players are going to have a very rough time. So it is incumbent on the DM to help them out, but they're going to take 2 or 3 rounds to figure out what's going on, whereas your experienced players are going to know what's going on before the combat even starts. And that delta grows, and it makes your game even more unbalanced than it is normally. So that's one reason why you don't see more of that vulnerability and immunity resistance.
Just excessive complexity.
I will say, I did just look up the fire elemental. Logan got in my head. And they don't have a vulnerability even to cold damage. What is that? Like,
you can fight one underwater.
Right? Like, you need to have, because what you're talking about there, that delta.
Yeah.
They take damage if water hits them. It says, like, if they're hit by more than a certain gallon of water.
It's a certain amount.
I didn't see that in my quick skim of the thing. So maybe not. Who knows? But it's just
you're right about the cold damage thing. Sorry.
When we're talking about this delta of information, right? I think that you can fill in some of that gap for newbie players by leaning on this is what my whole article series has been about. Leaning on pre-existing narrative, like, tropes that everyone has just, if you've grown up in a Western English speaking country, you have picked this stuff up just by experiencing life and, like, engaging in culture. And one of those things is, if you're fighting a fire monster, then dousing it with water should hurt it a bunch, and we don't have water damage, but the closest equivalent we have to that is cold damage. And if you blast a fire elemental with an icy spell, that should logically hurt it more. You know what I mean? Like, those little things should be there.
So, quick counterpoint, the fire elemental specifically does, not to gotcha, Dael, but the fire elemental does, although it's not a lot. Like, I did have a player who had a decanter of endless water and used the geyser ability to just shoot the fire elemental, which I forgot they had. I was like, oh, bugger. But it still didn't do that much damage to it in the long term.
So for every 5 feet the elemental moves in water, or for every gallon of water splashed on it, it takes 1 cold damage. It doesn't even... No. This is a win for me. This is a win for me. That is nothing. That is nothing. Are you kidding me with this?
Well, you're not wrong, but
garbage.
I mean, it is a magical creature. But the other thing, just quickly, is that vulnerabilities. I love resistances and immunities. I never use vulnerabilities unless it makes, like, really specific sense to. And the reason why is because, for the grittier, harder campaign that I try to run, the players are already so powerful. The advantage of being able to hit a vampire with radiant damage, being able to hit, a fire elemental with cold damage, is that it isn't resistant or immune to that type of damage. So the weakness exists because they're taking the full amount of damage. If that makes sense, it's sort of, it's balancing the numbers back away from that thing, just, from the Sun Sword just cutting Strahd in half the moment the party walks up to him. Sorry, Logan, what were you going to say?
I forgot.
Okay. Sorry.
I was going to say, I agree with Dael.
Yes. The counter to all of this is a fire elemental is not normal fire. A fire elemental is coming from... It would be like running...
Would you say that a spell that casts ice, though, is normal ice?
True. Absolutely. And so that's the balance of how balanced is throwing icicles at a wildfire as opposed to
Yeah.
I would love to go both ways with that. Some monsters aren't powerful enough to overwhelm the type of damage that would normally hurt them. And there's nothing worse than having a brand new player in front of you and they're up against an ice mephit, say, a low level creature, and they get this great idea. They have this spell, and then the stat block itself doesn't reinforce this great idea they had. That is the worst feeling of it. And as a DM, of course, you say, oh, and because you did that, it takes extra damage, whether you write it down or not. Just to reinforce this, you did a good thing. You were thinking, and we want that in this game. Yeah. So it's a tough balance all around to reward that while still keeping game balance what it's supposed to be.
I suppose that's true. And the other thing is, like, if I was ever playing in Ben's game and threw a bucket of water on a fire elemental and it didn't do any additional damage, I'd be upset about it. But if the story told me that this was a super fire element, this was the king of the fire, whatever, then it makes sense to me. You know what I mean? You've got that little bit of give and take. If this is just a fire elemental, let it turn into steam. Let me get some drama. I would be so upset.
With the bucket of water situation, I mean, you said if it doesn't do additional damage, I mean, buckets of water don't tend to do that much damage to most creatures. So by doing any damage, it's doing additional damage. But I mean, I guess that, like...
Benjamin, if you hit me with that in a game, I would be so mad at you. I would be so
But, like, if you have a bucket of water and there's a house on fire...
it is doing additional damage.
I'm melting!
If I'm in a D&D game and there's a house on fire and I throw some water on the fire, I expect the fire to be less bad now.
Yeah, no,
totally. Because it's a D&D game.
Yeah,
and I have limited things that I can do.
Sure. I mean, the fire's less bad. The house is still on fire, but hey, this specific corner of
I'm
it's
not saying
anymore.
that a bucket of water should kill the fire elemental. That's absurd. But I think that it should do damage. More than one damage.
No, well, how many gallons is the bucket?
Oh my God.
This conversation touches on an email, or actually, I think this was a comment on a previous episode on YouTube. So if you want us to discuss your comments, make them down below if you're watching on YouTube. This come from Cormac, and Cormac asked a question that I think leans into this discussion very much, and I think is something that I've kind of grappled with a little bit as well in how I rule and run damages and resistances when it comes to weapons specifically. Because you asked the question, or you were talking about it before, Dael and Shawn, about, is fire damage magical fire damage, is it not? They're asking the difference between mundane damage and magical damage specifically with weapons, because there's this concept of magical piercing, slashing, and bludgeoning damage, but that's the only real example where that is specifically mentioned in the rules. There's no difference in 5e between magical fire damage and fire damage. There's no monsters that are specifically resistant to non-magical fire damage versus magical fire damage, as opposed to being resistant to non-magical piercing damage and piercing damage. I hope that made sense. Yeah. But anyway, I guess Cormac's question being like, what's up with that? And how do you rule that? And how do you marry that with the rest of the rules? How do you make that make sense? And they were also asking, sorry, before I forget, why magic weapons usually have a +1, +2, whatever it is. They usually have some extra effect as well that makes them even more powerful. So it's like they overcome the resistance and they do extra damage. How do we grapple with those in our campaign?
I think narratively it's kind of interesting to think that when you're casting a spell, the accuracy of the spell is not based on you being a sharpshooter. It's based on your charisma or whatever modifier your class uses. So to think that the people who made these magical weapons kind of crafted them to guide your thrust or the way that you swing your sword so that it hits more vulnerable points or that it hits in the way that it's supposed to. But it is weird that it overcomes certain armor types or resistances. I think that is just a very strange aspect of it that I've never really put a whole lot of thought into.
Well, I have. Because
Tell us.
well, we had a conversation earlier in an earlier episode about, and I think this was the episode that Cormac commented on, about is magical piercing damage or piercing damage from a spell, more specifically, magical for the purposes of overcoming resistances and immunities. And I had always assumed no, because in no other circumstance, when you cast Fireball, it's not specified to be magical fire damage. And we've already had that conversation specifically. But when it comes to weapons, there is a weird disconnect there. And often what I would do in my games and have experimented with is having weapons that are like, +1, or they have some other magical effect, or like a Thor's hammer style thing where it counts as a war hammer, can only be wielded one-handed, and it can be thrown and returned back to you in a single turn. But it doesn't do magical damage because it's a magical weapon, but it's just doing bludgeoning damage. It's not doing specifically magical damage. And then have introduced alternative damage types being specifically silver and adamantine, which adamantine and silver damage exist in the game technically, though not as a damage type. But it says in stat blocks, resistant to piercing, slashing, bludgeoning, unless the weapon is magical or silvered. And so delineating silver as a specific type of piercing, slashing, and bludgeoning creates a situation where magic weapons don't become a cure-all for every monster. Your adamantine weapon will cut through an elemental or a construct, but it's not going to be any use against lycanthropes, and silver weapons kind of vice versa, which is a desire to not have one tool for every situation, but have multiple tools for multiple situations. Geralt of Rivia carries 2 swords specifically for that reason. That's just my thoughts
counter for the day. Yeah, I think there's some really weird stuff when you start to get into this question with D&D in particular, because you've got this divide of resistant to bludgeoning, piercing, slashing from non-magical weapons, and then players will reach a point where they get magical weapons, and that just doesn't matter anymore, right? It seems to be more than anything a divide to say, this is a monster for low-level play, this is a monster that is for high-level play. Your players have magical weapons now, and so now they can just cut a ghost.
And that really does feel like the extent of it.
Yeah, right? And it bugs me. It is something that really bugs me, that in particular, more than the idea of specific resistances and vulnerabilities. Those seem to be narratively driven. They seem to be something that people probably inherently understand on some level. Like, for example, if you're fighting something that's made of fire, maybe water will hurt it. That kind of a thing. That, to me, reads as more logical within the narrative than just saying, I don't know, man, it's because the weapons aren't magic, but once they are magic, doesn't matter. I don't think that a magical weapon should automatically be able to kill a ghost. That's something...
Yeah, there is one aspect of this where just about everything that has resistance to those damage types is a planar creature. It comes from a different dimension than the one that you're bringing the weapons from. So that could be a major narrative point, but there are exceptions to it.
That's true. And I mean, it's tricky for a lot of the reasons. I think that it, more than the other vulnerabilities that we've been talking about, it does lead to players getting really bored because it does just become a slog. If you encounter something before you have magical weapons that has resistance to non-magical weapons, you're just going to have to hit it for twice as long. It's not going to stop the players from fighting it, and it's really just one of those things that really discourages DMs from putting those monsters in front of their players, too soon, quote unquote. But I mean, to the other part of the question, the idea of why do these weapons get to be, they get to double dip into the power boost. I think the part of that is this constant back and forth of how do we balance magic casters and martial classes, because the spellcasters can just do stuff. They can choose different damages. They can, they've got all this flexibility and all this power. Things like the fact that a lot of spells don't even have to be aimed they just work because it would be silly to be a wizard and to be told, actually, your magic didn't work today, right? That wouldn't be fun. So spells just automatically hit, and then it's on the other person to roll a save. So it's a very complicated situation when you try to balance marshals against that, and they're always going to be rolling to attack. They're always going to be, limited by their equipment to some degree. So I think the idea initially, seemingly, was to kind of give the marshals a boost. They get all these magic weapons. A wizard can't use a magic sword. So here we are. The marshals get to catch up a little bit in that regard. So of course we're going to let them double dip because they need to in order to feel powerful in the equivalent. The trouble, of course, is that there are magic items for magic users as well. So you end up in this bizarre place where, in reaction to spellcasters, marshals get these powerful weapons, but because the marshals get powerful weapons, the magic casters feel like, I didn't get a special artifact, so then you have to give them a special artifact. It just stacks on top of itself.
Mm-hmm. At the start of 5e, the designers said, we are creating a game where you do not need to have magic items to be powerful enough to succeed as a character. And I jumped for joy. I jumped for joy because I thought this would be the first edition where that's true, or at least it'd be the first edition where magic items were not even considered. In 4th edition, they just assumed that you would have a magic item, and that as you leveled, the magic plus of the magic item fit into the math of the game. So if you did not have that +4 magic item at 20th level, you were weaker than they had intended. So getting rid of that made me happy. However, we are playing this game that we, over the years, have played so much that magic items are a given. Everyone expects magic items. They expect them too often sometimes, and they expect them to make them powerful. And
I blame video games.
Well, yeah. Well, I blame D&D and then the video games. I blame
fair.
1st edition D&D, which many games,
It's the progenitor.
then it just snowballed from there. Exactly. But part of it too is, we talk about making these tactical combats where players have to think and do things. But then we also give them magic items so they don't have to think and do things, right? There are things that you can do, even with a monster like the Wolfware, where if you don't have a magical weapon, you cannot damage it. It is immune to damage, not just resistant.
Yeah.
So, and that's a low-level creature. So it's like, what can we do? Well, I have a magic weapon spell. I can actually cast that on the, make the fighter. I'm going to have to waste my turn to do that, but here we go. Now the fighter can fight. But I don't want to waste my turn because it's all about, damage per round, right? Instead of how are we working together as a team. I'm going to use all of my actions to aid, to help, right? I'm going to give my fighter advantage because my magic, I only can cast fire spells when we're fighting a fire elemental. So I'm going to aid their attack.
I had
to
a bucket of water.
Them. Exactly. So, that's something that this game would facilitate with things like resistances and immunities. But sometimes we as players get so caught up in, I have to do the most powerful thing this round right now without thinking about cool stories going on around it or ways that we could work together, that we want our silvered +1 weapon. We want our +2 cold iron weapon that can only that's useful against Fae. We want this. We want the adamantine weapon, and so we have a golf bag full of weapons rather than playing the cool game of how can I work with my teammates to be as efficient as possible.
In our party, we actually kind of found a narrative exploit where we decided that any weapon that had a magical aspect to it was technically a magical weapon. It was augmented by magic. So we got so stupid to the point where we would cast light on a dagger to make it glow so that it did magic damage.
Yeah.
It was
well,
glowing.
that is one thing that's a great point. Common weapons common magical items are magical items. So if you have a common sword that its only magic is that it's always sharp or that it's always clean or that it sings, that's a magic weapon.
I love
it doesn't
those types
need
of
the
weapons.
+1. It doesn't need all that. So if you are a DM that wants to give a magical weapon but doesn't want the +4 reality slayer, you can just then give a common magic item that glows, that does something mundane. That's a magical weapon that can overcome those resistances.
And there's a few of them in the Dungeon Master's Guide before magic items, where it's just like, this was crafted by dwarven people and it's really like easy to attune to. It's things that are intended to augment already magic items, but if you apply them to non-magic items, they're still fully functional.
Yep.
I mean, one of the other things that I feel like is sort of drifting to the surface in this conversation is this thing where tabletop RPGs have become, I mean, I hate to do, I'm on record saying that I'm pro taking stuff from video games and putting them into tabletop RPGs. So remember that when I say that there is this video gamey element now, right? Of, and it probably pre-existed video games, but I'm new, don't blame me. It's really this idea of this is combat. This is a game about combat, right? Which really loses one of the greatest, most powerful tools that tabletop RPGs have, which is that you can respond in any way that you want, right? Combat doesn't have to be hit it with your sword. Combat can be grab the bucket of water. Combat can be, using this spell that you have to do something that is a utility or that just, changes the battlefield. Like you can approach it in any number of different ways. And when we do turn magic items into a thing of, here's a sword, it's a +2 sword, and also it's extra good against dragons, it reinforces that idea of go and hit the thing, which is fine. Going and hitting the thing is fine. I play a fighter, I get it. But, there's so much more to it. My favorite magic items to give out are the ones where I'm like, I have no idea how you're going to find this useful, but here you go. Like, it does a thing, that thing is cool, but that thing is not damage dealing. Those are my favorite magic items because it really, when it's done right, it unlocks the part of players' brains where they go, oh, wait, yeah, like I can do other stuff. I can do other stuff. And that's, I don't know, that's my favorite. And that's why I think you should be able to douse a fire elemental
with a bucket of water. Yeah, I agree. Usually when I'm thinking up magic items, I'm thinking what would be in the place where it's found rather than what would be useful for the party. I think I didn't think this up. This was from Tomb of Annihilation. And I often homebrew modules so much that I can't remember what I put in there and what was already in the module. But I think this was already in the module, was this riverside temple that at the center of it, it's this Indiana Jones style trap obstacle course that you have to go through to get the MacGuffin at the end. And it's an alchemy jug. And I explained to my players that, as they got through all these death-defying traps, they're like, man, what's back here must be important if they went to these lengths to protect it. And I explained to them that, the ancient elves that, built this place, the symbol of their culture was this jug that could produce all the elements, all the natural resources that they used to survive that they got from the land. And that's why they worshipped it so much. And the players' disappointment at getting through all these traps to find this jug that gave them mayonnaise and vinegar quickly turned to like, oh, that's nice.
Water is a super important resource in that module.
Especially if fire elementals show up.
Yeah, right?
Yes.
Yeah. We are quickly running out of time, but we had one more question, a comment on YouTube that I quickly wanted to get to, which was from Walt. This was on last week's episode where we talked about the sausage roll. And I've just got to ask, do you not have meat products in your bakeries in America? Like, do they not sell pies or pastries or anything? Is it
No, it's all about fat and sugar. Yeah. For the most part.
Yeah,
That's so sad. I mean, don't get me wrong, I love the fat and sugar, but...
Well, over here, bakeries are like, lunchtime, go to the bakery. Breakfast, go to the bakery. Dinner, go to the bakery.
The closest extent is like cheese on a lot of them, like cheese danishes and stuff. Or if you go to like a bagel place, they will put meat on the bagel, but that's kind of the extent of it.
Yeah, see, I don't think we'd find a bagel in a bakery, though.
I don't think we would.
No, bakeries are kind of like specifically pastry goods.
Yeah, in the U.S., if we hear meat pie, we think of like Oliver Twist.
I think like a Hot Pocket.
It's
Oliver.
Yeah, that's
Oliver.
true. Yes, exactly. Can I have a meat pie? No.
Yeah, right. Okay, that's interesting.
Please, sir, can I have a sausage roll?
Well, that brings us to just about time. If you want to chat with us, send us a comment down below on YouTube or email us podcast@ghostfiregaming.com. We will take your questions. We will chat about them. They will spur discussion like they have today. So please do get in touch with us. If you want to contact us through our socials, our social handles are just below our names if you're watching this on YouTube. And make sure that you go out there and spread the word of the Eldritch Lorecast. Pin it to a bounty board and attach a reward to it for all adventurers to go and listen to the Eldritch Lorecast, because we'll be back next week. I've been Ben Byrne here with Dael Kingsmill, Logan Reese, Shawn Merwin. Until next week, goodbye.